climate watch, Louisiana is continuing to recover from the havoc left behind by Hurricane Laura, as many residents search for homes on higher ground. Hundreds of people have already scattered across the state, and many may never return to their homes again. Others are struggling to find shelter in cities like Lafayette, where officials are refusing to offer aid. And some are forced to sleep in their cars until it's safe to return to their property. So with me now to discuss his latest piece, Louisiana's population is already moving to escape climate catastrophe, is Tim McDonnell. Tim, you're a reporter for Quartz covering climate change and energy, and it's a really, really interesting topic. And I think back to covering Hurricane Katrina, working in Philadelphia, and the number of stories we did on people who, fled New Orleans because of the hurricane, wound up in Philadelphia with the idea that they would perhaps return and just never did. So you wrote that Louisiana could be the first state in the U.S. to witness a large-scale climate-related migration. What exactly does that look like? And is there enough land for people to move to sort of be safe?
Yeah, the case of Louisiana is so interesting, and it's something that it's a kind of microcosm of something we're seeing all over the world, people moving to escape climate-related disasters, which could be hurricanes, like you've mentioned, but also slower moving changes like sea level rise or droughts, other things like that. And so Louisiana is a place where the coastal part of the state has been experiencing a lot of land loss, sea level rise, other impacts. And people who are living in that area, the state has spent a lot of time and resources over the last few years studying these trends of population movement. And what they're finding is that the counties that are at the sort of bottom edge of the state there are losing population. Those that are a little bit better protected from impacts are gaining population. And so the state is at this point now of trying to figure out, what does that mean? How can these communities that are sort of on the receiving end of that population movement do a better job of planning for that, trying to prepare for their cities to become not only larger, but also more diverse in terms of race and income and other factors. And so that's really the challenge that the state is grappling with. And in at least one case, they've gone through this process of actually relocating an entire community from one place to another.
So let's talk a little bit more about these receiving communities, these cities and towns that suddenly find themselves dealing with essentially climate refugees. You wouldn't think you would sort of use that phrase when you're talking about the U.S. How are they dealing with the influx? Often, what we see is that particularly vulnerable communities that maybe are, low-lying areas, more prone to flooding, are also communities in need, economically challenged communities. And so you have a lot of people that are not only fleeing their homes, but they were already in need before they fled. They're leaving behind the very little that they had. So how are these receiving communities handling this?
Yeah, I think, right now, it's, I think, safe to say that that process is just beginning. And for the most part, maybe that, not too much is really happening on this front, other than the beginning of a conversation about what that change needs to look like. And, that comes down to a lot of the same sorts of reforms that cities really need across the board to just become more equitable and sustainable and functional for everyone, even beyond just the scope of climate change. So we're talking about better access to affordable housing, schools, obviously better kind of infrastructure protection from flooding and other kinds of climate impacts. And so it's really kind of reforming the way that cities function to be able to receive more people. And, that's a challenge that, like I said, they're really just beginning to grapple with right now.
Right. And so you mentioned, a whole community being moved, and you sort of used the example of a specific tribe in Louisiana that was forced off their land because of rising sea levels and then relocated. And you look at this sort of as an example of things to come, if you will. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Right. So this is an island community that's in that sort of fringe part of the bottom of the state. This is an island that a few decades ago was about the same size as Manhattan, actually, but up to today has lost about 98% of its land area because of land subsidence and sea level rise. And so there's about 100 people who had been living there. And over the last few years, the state, with some funding from the federal government and working closely with community leaders on this island who are predominantly Native American, have been working on this plan to relocate this community wholesale off of the island to another site. They recently chose a location. It's about 40 miles north of the original island. It's actually in a sugarcane field. This was a site that the community themselves selected and voted on. And they're actually right now just in the beginning of clearing that land, starting construction on that new site. They're going to have a few dozen households that are moving there. They're building a community center, a market space, a festival space, some other kinds of attributes of the area that were sort of designed very intentionally with input from the community to try to preserve the things about the original island that people really cherished, their sense of privacy, sense of community, the kind of cultural traditions that they carried on in that place. So that process, but not everybody in that community has been happy with the outcome. Not everyone is moving. There's a couple dozen people who have chosen not to go. And so, part of the issue is there was some disagreement about who this new site would be for. Is it simply moving this existing community from point A to point B? Or as the community had originally kind of had a vision for, could this be a chance to reconvene a larger group of the tribal membership, people who hadn't lived on the island originally or maybe hadn't lived there for years or decades? And there was some tension between the community and the state on that question. But it seems like at this point, people have sort of made their decision. They're moving forward with construction, and people should be moving to the new site by next year, hopefully.
It's interesting. I mentioned that, what we have been seeing a lot of is that economically challenged communities, often Black and brown communities, their neighborhoods, their homes are being built on land that is particularly vulnerable to Mother Nature. It's not always that case. Sometimes, there's these high-priced homes on the coast or whatever, second homes, but increasingly, the conversation that we're having is about city planning, is about not just the ferocity of Mother Nature, but the fact that we are building homes in areas that are vulnerable. And so, you're going to see, billion-dollar losses if homes are in places that they're below sea level. So can we talk a little bit more about just like government planning, the ways in which we build, and whether or not that conversation is coming up when it comes to, the government in Louisiana?
This is a really important question, and I think this is something that we really tried to explore in this story. And also, this story is part of a larger package of stories that we produced this week about climate migration and urbanization from different perspectives. And Louisiana is one example, but there are others. The question of what do we sort of build to prepare for the future that we know we're going to have is really important. Having a vision that will allow us to kind of not repeat the mistakes of the past and do things like, as you just mentioned, building housing for communities of color in places that are very vulnerable to climate impacts or that are exposed to pollution from power plants or other industrial facilities. I mean, this obviously has happened repeatedly over the decades. And, if we're going to have a conversation about receiving communities that are receiving climate migrants that are going to be growing, we need to talk about building new housing in those places, but we need to not repeat the mistakes of the past. We need to have a vision for creating a city that is more equitable for everyone. And that's what we were trying to look at with this piece here is actually just doing some vision planning, some thinking about what needs to go into that process so that we can ensure that as we're building new cities or expanding existing cities, that we're doing it in a way that is just. I mean, I was very fascinated in my research for this story to look more closely at one of the last instances of mass migration that we had in this country, which of course was the Great Migration of Black Americans from the South to the North in the early and mid 20th century during the Jim Crow era. There were about 6 million Black Americans that made that journey. And in that process, cities like New York and Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, others became a lot more diverse. There was an incredible explosion of cultural and economic achievements that came out of that movement. But there was also a lot of Northern racism that happened there. And it was sort of that process was kind of the root of some of the racist housing policies that we've seen over the last few decades. redlining and white flight into the suburbs. And so we want to make sure that as this new era of kind of climate-related migration takes place, that we do it better this time. That's what we're really trying to look at with this story.
Yeah, it's a really important conversation to have, Tim. I'm really glad you were able to join us. Tim McDonnell, thank you.
Thank you very much.
So you can watch our originals documentary, Rising Tide, Priced Out in Miami, to learn more about how rising sea levels are impacting gentrification and housing prices in the Florida city.